Okay, I think I know most people, but I'm Jim Rooney, President and CEO of the Greater Boston Chamber of Commerce, and I want to welcome you to today's special event, How the Commonwealth Competes, Measuring Our Competitive Edge. Now, many of you who follow the Chamber or are members know that our purpose at the Chamber is to make this region the best place for all businesses and all people to thrive, and we underscore those words all. That means that we're committed to the success of the people, the communities, the businesses throughout the Commonwealth. The challenges we face as a global city and state is from the competition who want their regions to succeed as well. Competition from older, more established places like New York, Chicago, Atlanta, Dallas, and competition from the new and up-and-coming economic centers in this country, like Austin, Nashville, and Raleigh, and the Research Triangle. Last year, we visited the Research Triangle with a group of leaders, some people in this room included, also with the Lieutenant Governor, Secretary Howe, Mayor Wu. And we observed how the state that has been recognized for the past 2 years as the best place to do business approached competitiveness. Interestingly, when we got there, their chamber had just completed an event that they branded, and this was what they called it on their advertising, How the Research Triangle Can Become the New Boston in Biotech. So that's what they were doing down in North Carolina. Boston and Massachusetts have a long history of economic success and much to offer with our talented workforce as a competitive advantage. But we cannot fall into the trap of competitive complacency, and the Chamber will be at the forefront of this effort as we were in leading the effort for tax cuts in 2023. Right now, we face the challenge of people leaving our region for more affordable cities and states. A highly mobile workforce, public transit, housing costs and inventory, and a high cost of living are just some of the competitive challenges. Our event today will discuss the findings of the Massachusetts Competitive Index and the possible solutions so we can sustain and grow our region's economic success. When our friends at Mass Taxpayers Foundation, led by Doug Howgate, released their competitive index, we were excited to continue this important conversation with them. A big thank you to Doug and the Mass Taxpayers Foundation for their partnership on an ongoing basis and for putting this event together. Today we're joined by about 100 people in this room and hundreds more virtually to discuss bolstering the competitiveness of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Now I'm going to introduce who the speakers on the panel are and then turn it over to Jay Ash to make some comments as well. First, Doug Howgate, the president of the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation, is president of MTF. Doug is a leader of public policy through unbiased research and constructive solutions that benefit every industry and community. Next is Sara Fraim, the CEO of the Massachusetts Technology Leadership Council. Sara is known for her regional leadership that has been instrumental in growing our dynamic technology ecosystem. And we're joined by Jane Steinmetz, Managing Principal of the Boston office of EY and a member of the Chamber Executive Committee. Jane brings over 25 years of experience serving Fortune 100 clients and leading high-performing teams. Now, just a quick note about logistics. This event is being recorded and will be available on the Chamber's YouTube page for people's viewing later. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Jay Ash, CEO of the Massachusetts Competitive Partnership, for some remarks before we turn the program over to Doug. Jay?
Thank you, and Jim, thank you, and thank the Chamber for hosting this event and your continuing work on competitiveness. It's important that we all work together to Massachusetts and the best foot forward, and the Chamber is certainly an important part of that. So, Jim, thank you for having me here. I'm excited to be here to hear more from Doug and from our panel, but before we do that, I thought I would just take a moment to talk a little bit about the evolution of how we got here in the first place. So, as Jim introduced, as many of you know, I run the Massachusetts Competitive Partnership. Our middle name is Competitiveness. No surprise when we get 20 of the leading CEOs of Massachusetts, well, frankly, not Massachusetts, not even the country, when we have 20 of the leading CEOs from around the world who sit at regular meetings and talk about the competitiveness of the Massachusetts economy, it's no surprise that that middle part of our name is the most important part of the discussion. And during those competitiveness discussions, we hear regularly that there's concern out there about the competitiveness of Massachusetts, and our CEOs, who have an opportunity to see what's happening around the country and world, express interest in making sure that we are doing everything we can to promote the competitiveness of Massachusetts. Our CEOs recognize that opinions without data are reasons to be concerned, but aren't the same as having facts. And when you have opinions that are supported by data, you can start to talk about the issues that are before you as though they are facts. When we thought about the work that we do at MACP, we identify issues, we study them, we make recommendations on how to solve them, and then we go out and actually work with others to get them solved. In thinking about wanting to talk more about the competitiveness of the Massachusetts economy, we wanted to, in fact, study and get the data necessary in order to be able to best determine what it is that we all can then do together to make Massachusetts more competitive. When we thought about the study, we thought about, wouldn't it be great to find an experienced partner who has been trusted and has proven time and again that their ability to assemble data, to explain data to us, and to promote the environment that helps us to take that data and turn it into action is very important. And of course, we turn to the Massachusetts Taxpayers Foundation. So Mass Taxpayers Foundation, almost 100 years old, has been doing just that in the state for as long as I've been around. For 40 years in public policy in my world, I've relied upon Mass Taxpayers Foundation for its work. In fact, Doug, I was reflecting on this morning. As I was going to talk about the 40 years of my time in public policy, 18 of those years was spent in city government. And during that time, I relied upon the Mass Taxpayers Foundation. There was the publication the Mass Taxpayers Foundation used to put out that was a small booklet of cities and towns, and that you turn it sideways and you'd have to really squint to read it. But it had every piece of information you wanted to know about what cities and towns were spending, how they were raising the money, what they had for reserves. And I used that over and over and over again to help the Chelsea City Council understand what we were doing in Chelsea. So Mass Taxpayers has been an important part of the work forever. You know, the last part of our name is partnership. And so it's no surprise that we wanted to bring in a partner. And when I think about the great partners that we have, including many that are in the room today, Doug has been a great partner to all of us. Doug has been a senior public policy official for many years and has distinguished himself amongst all of us in terms of being smart, being thorough, having great communication skills, and being a credible representative for whatever topic is being discussed. So it was natural for MACP, when we were looking for a partner to talk about competitiveness, we actually reached out to Doug, and Doug said yes, because Doug was thinking about the same thing at the same time, which often happens as well. So partnership, competitive Massachusetts. Well, I should flip them around so it's Massachusetts Competitive Partnership. Finding Doug was the right way to go. So Doug, on behalf of all of us, but especially on behalf of the 20 CEOs at MACP who voted to fund and are very appreciative of the index that you put together. Thank you for your continuing work. Look forward to this discussion and others to go on. Doug, welcome aboard.
Thank you, Jay. Thanks, Jim. Thanks to everyone at the Chamber who put this event together and for the Competitive Partnership for their partnership and support on this index that I'm about to go over. And before I get started, I will be mindful of time. I want to thank you for also highlighting the importance of the municipal data book we used to put out. I always tell my staff that because they refuse to do it anymore. So, all right, with that, we're going to get started. We're going to have a great panel discussion, but I think we're going to kind of preview that with a little bit of what was in this index. And I know I move my head too much when I talk, so I will try not to do that this year. So we're going to talk a little bit about what's in this index. And really, as we get started, we're going to talk about kind of why we wanted to look at this, how we looked at it, a little bit on our findings, and then kind of what it means, how we apply it, which I think should lead well into the panel discussion to follow. So in terms of the why, because everyone is talking about competitiveness, as Jim mentioned, not just in Massachusetts, but in every region of the country, as Jay mentioned, this is top of mind for all of the people in his organization. So why are we looking at this topic that has been kind of discussed to death? And I think there's kind of three reasons we wanted to really take a look. One is, I think a lot of the analysis on this right now isn't particularly constructive for doing something about making sure Massachusetts continues to be competitive, continues to be strong in the areas that we're historically strong at, and gets better in new areas. And this is just a couple examples of, and it wouldn't take a lot of Googling to find more of, one study's gonna say we're the worst in the world, one study's gonna say we're the best in the world, one study's gonna give us a C-, one's gonna give us a 9.2. All of these things that are helpful and interesting, but they don't really tell you much, right? And when you think about what Massachusetts does well, what we can do better, we all know it's more nuanced than this, right? It's more nuanced than one score, best or worst. And if we're gonna have actionable public policy changes, we need to understand and look under the hood, right? So that was kind of one reason. I think the other thing we wanted to make sure was part of the discussion is that so much of this has come up since the pandemic, since some policy choices like the surtax over the last few years has really kind of energized this discussion of competitiveness. But a lot of the fundamentals that undergird our challenges and our strengths aren't about the last 3 years, right? These are things that have been in place for many, many, many years. And if we don't understand that, our policy actions aren't going to be particularly effective. And this is really the most important chart, right? This to me is the ballgame. The working age population in Massachusetts is down some 200,000 folks or so in the last 20 years, right? This is not a pandemic chart. Did the pandemic make things worse? Yes, it absolutely did. But when we think about the long-standing trends that we need to make sure we're accounting for in our policy actions and being honest with ourselves about, this to me is kind of where it starts and ends, right? And when you think about what we can do about this and the discussion then about how we make Massachusetts attractive for people who live here now, for people who want to move here, it's a pretty simple story, right? Bottom line is, our birth rate is down 30% over the last 30 years, right? Natural population growth is not going to be a long-standing or at least a short-term element of how we grow in the next 10, 15 years. And that's where this chart comes up. So this is on the left side, it's domestic migration, and on the right side, it's international immigration in Massachusetts. And it could not be more of a tale of two cities, right? Net domestic outmigration has been a weakness for Massachusetts for a long time, and that weakness has been hugely exacerbated in the last few years. That's just the reality of the data. On the flip side, international immigration continues to be what has allowed the Massachusetts labor force to continue to grow in spite of challenging demographic figures, and is spiking in recent years. Now, as we know with the migrant crisis, that presents challenges as well. But when we think about what is going to enable Massachusetts to succeed, we need to be honest about the chart on the left, domestic outmigration, and we need to understand the opportunity that is the chart on the right, right? And then the last thing, and this just demonstrates that kind of, if you were to Google a lot of these issues that we're about to talk about, that you hear about, these issues were present prior to the pandemic, right? Demographic challenges, the fact that we're excellent in things like education, and kind of some of the natural strengths of our economy. And so the reason why I think this takes on so much more import now is because the pandemic has changed some things, right? This is a chart of domestic outmigration by county in Massachusetts, and it is a mirror image of what this chart would have looked like in 2019, right? What you see is big negative numbers in Middlesex and Suffolk. You actually see growth in places like the Cape, Hampshire County, right? What this indicates is some of the factors that are leading to people's location choices have changed. Maybe not permanently. No one knows how much of this is a blip, how much is going to last forever. But this is a fundamental shift in what we had taken for granted about, hey, people may not want to have to work in Boston, but they have to, right? So we're going to rely on that. That's not what we're seeing in the data, and that's what requires us to really, I think, take a look at this work. All right, so as we think about this competitiveness index, we're really trying to do two things, right? So one is set forth kind of a conceptual framework of competitiveness. And the idea here is we have long-standing demographic challenges in Massachusetts, like any other northeastern state. We also have an incredibly talented workforce that forms a bit of a virtuous cycle with our economic sectors, which is a strength that no one else has, right? Those are kind of the two ends of the spectrum. What's changing in the middle is how much things like cost, things like commute time are changing people's calculations about where they want to be. How much has that changed and what can we do about it? And that's really where the policy levers are most important. So that's the framework. And then what we wanted to do is we want to establish a baseline, right? This isn't a one and done type exercise. as we're looking at how we're going to understand the impact of policy changes that are being considered or that have been implemented, we need to look at this next year, the year after. Are we getting better? Are we getting worse? Because as we look at our points of comparison, the most important point is, are we getting better compared to ourselves, right? And then the other thing we wanted to do is think about how we're assessing our competition. Certainly we want to do a rank out of all 50 states, and the index does that. But we also wanted to break that down into two smaller subsets. So one is our economic competitors. And our economic competitors, we identified, and I want to give a big shout out to the UMass Donohue Institute, who worked with us on all these metrics. As we think about our economic competitors, who we're losing jobs to, you return a list that's Texas, North Carolina, Florida, New York, and California, which I think also kind of passes the smell test, right? So that's one rubric we want to compare ourselves to. But then also I think increasingly we have some local competitors, right? It is more legitimate for folks now to maybe relocate to New Hampshire, Vermont, Maine, and still keep a foothold in Massachusetts, and the data bear this out, so we want to look at that. All right, so in terms of where we stand, we looked at 4 categories of competitiveness. Underlying economic health, underlying demographics, business employment and investment factors, and then kind of quality of life, resident life. And what you see is there's a mix, right? Massachusetts has a number of strengths. We consistently have places where we're weak. The place that kind of consistently shows up as a weakness is that business employment and investments factor category. That's where we are more often than not, bringing up the rear in terms of our economic competitors. And so, as we look at those competitors, I won't go into the geographic because that's a bit of a mixed bag, but in terms of economic competitors, what you see here is probably what you would expect, right? Florida, North Carolina, Texas, these are states that when you look at some of those cost elements, some of those investment elements, you're seeing greater and greater separation there than with Massachusetts. All right, so now let me talk a little bit about our strengths and weaknesses before we kick it to the panel. So in terms of strengths, there are, of the 26 metrics we looked at, there are 7 places where Massachusetts ranks at the top or near the top, both nationally and among our competitors. And it really kind of falls into 3 categories, right? First and foremost is education. Massachusetts absolutely has the most educated populace and workforce in the country. And I think it's easy to underestimate just how critical that is to our success and what an asset that is to Massachusetts. 4th and 8th grade math and reading scores, Massachusetts has been effectively first consistently for 20 years, right? And so when we think about what we can't afford to lose, that's got to be number 1, right? And it also translates to share of our population 25 and older with a bachelor's degree. And what does that mean? That means it also connects to our economy, right? So this shows you research and development as a share of our gross state product. We could come up with a number of metrics that indicate that these sectors that are so strong in Massachusetts, many of which are represented here, are closely connected to the fact that smart people live here, right? And there can be confident that there are going to be more smart people tomorrow. And what this means is, 1, it can act as a magnet, especially for international immigration in Massachusetts, and we're often at the leading edge of new sectors that rely on smart people, right? That is a great strength to have. And the last thing on the strength, kind of themes is this quality of life element, right? When you look at life expectancy, you see Massachusetts ranked towards the top nationwide. And to me, this speaks to a couple things, right? It speaks to a strong healthcare system. It speaks to public safety, right? It speaks to a couple kind of under the hood factors that Massachusetts really does stand an advantage to compared to a lot of our competitors. So those are some great strengths to have. So now let's go to weaknesses, right? And again, we're going to see some themes here. So there's about 10 categories where we show up as at the bottom of the pack or near the bottom of the pack. And again, to me, this is number 1 by far. Our labor force is smaller now than it was in 2018. We have gained back some of the job losses or labor force losses during the pandemic. We're still not where we were at in 2018, 2019. And if you're not growing your labor force, your economy's ability to grow is limited, right? This is fundamentally what all of our efforts, I think, need to be in service of. And when you think of what's driving that, there's many factors, but a lot of it gets down to cost, whether it's cost for people, cost for employers, things like that. Housing costs, right? Childcare costs, UI taxes, corporate taxes, energy costs, things like that. Now, I want to be clear. We have been a high-cost state for a long time. We are likely to continue to be a high-cost state. And hopefully we buy something for those high costs. We buy better services and things like that. But when you're making a marginal decision about where you can afford to be, it absolutely matters. And we need to understand that as well. And then as we think about kind of the policy fundamentals of where we go. Housing emerges, and I think transportation emerges, right? It's not just about costs that are financial, it's costs like commute time, right? When you no longer have to be in the office every day, the fact that in Massachusetts you're likely to be stuck in traffic for longer than you are in other places, that's going to be a competitive disadvantage for Massachusetts. And so we're trying to find things here that start to connect to policy levers Massachusetts may have in the years going forward. All right, so bottom line, and then I'll wrap up. So as we think about who's leading, as we think about who we're competing for, a couple themes emerge. So one, by income level, the largest share of those leaving Massachusetts is the highest wealth families, right? So they're the third largest share of the state's population, they're the largest share of out migrants. That's a problem. What is also a problem is families making between $35,000 and $100,000, so kind of lower middle income to middle income, they're the other place where they're leaving disproportionate to their share of the population. And those are kind of two pillars of your economy you absolutely need, and that's a big cause for concern, especially when it's overlaid by this, right? That we are seeing increasingly out-migration of 26 to 35-year-olds. It's true if you go to 44 as well. So think of this. Our out-migration for folks 26 to 35 is about double what it was in 2018, right? That is kind of an ongoing factor that the economy of Massachusetts simply cannot withstand, right? So that's why this is so important and why I think there's such a clear policy nexus to things like housing, like childcare, like transportation. All right, and then the last thing I'll do is just what we want to do going forward is apply this index, right? And so when you think about some of the big bills that were done or will hopefully be done soon on Beacon Hill, tax relief, Affordable Homes Act, some of the child care provisions in the state budget, when you look at the economic development bill, I think the good news is you see efforts to address policies that relate to cost, relate to talent. None of these things are going to be a silver bullet, right? But I think what we need to continue to do is make the case that all of these major pieces of legislation need to have in view how they relate to these ongoing challenges of what our cost differentials are and what are we doing to keep talent in the state and attract talent. And I'll just finish with this idea of how we apply this index going forward, right? Because that's what's going to make it important is if we're able to use this for policy work. And here's where I think something like the ballot question on eliminating a statewide standard for graduation, that comes into play, right? When you look at the strengths of Massachusetts, what we do well, K-12 education is really at the cornerstone of that. And so when you think about a policy that's going to undo one of the kind of the fundamental elements of our attempt to create some level of consistency to that K-12 system, clearly that's not a step in the right direction, right? Now, we'll see what happens in November, but I do think as we think about kind of, do we need to make our K-12 system better? Yes, is it excellent in every community in the Commonwealth? Absolutely not. But taking for granted some of these things that we do well and assuming no matter what policy infrastructure we put in place, we'll continue to do well, I think that's the way we give up on some of the advantages we currently have. So that's kind of how we'll be applying this index going forward. But with that, Jim, I'll hand it back to you and we can move on with the panel.
All right, let's go. All right.
Well, so first, Doug and your team, thank you for doing a great job on assembling all of that data and, highlighting, how to measure competitiveness. And you said there's a lot of metrics around, and it was that CNBC report that you referenced that the team in North Carolina probably market themselves about. When I was in North Carolina, I asked the person who's in charge of economic development for the state, what do they say about Boston and Massachusetts when they're competing against us for something? And the guy didn't hesitate. He said, tell them about your commute time, and traffic and congestion. So, having been in the business of competing with others, it's not just telling your story. You weave in a little bit about the competitors too, and that's what they say about us. Jane and Sara, I want to start with you guys. Doug just gave a great overview of the report and competitiveness, both the good and the bad in Massachusetts. I'm sure you've had a chance to look at the report itself. Share some of your thoughts. What stuck out to you? What resonated as you heard this presentation and read the report?
Sure, I'll start next since I have this microphone. First of all, well done. I mean, hats off to the MTF team for such a well thought through report and information. I guess what resonated with me is the complexity of the situation. You know, it's not one factor that's gonna be the silver bullet that makes Massachusetts competitive vis-a-vis other states. It's really gonna be multifaceted. So I believe that if we're going to be competitive, we're gonna have to come up with solutions that really span the spectrum of the issues that help to retain our low wage, middle income, and high net worth individuals. That helps to retain and attract entrepreneurs, small businesses, and our large employers. And there's just different factors that are gonna come into play. So I have 4 kids going off to college, and all I hear is Southern schools. It's like this phenomenon. All the kids want to go to Southern schools. I don't know if anyone saw the Wall Street Journal article last week, raising hands, yeah. And it actually put a fine point as to why. You know, it could be lower cost, it could be fun on social media. But what really struck me is it says a lot of students are looking to Southern schools, 2/3 stay. So not only do we have this phenomenon going on in Southern schools, 2/3 stay because of jobs and lower cost housing. So we have to fix the housing problem so that they want to come back here and they can afford to come back here. But then we also have to think about high net worth individuals and large employers that have the jobs. So that's why I think it's going to be a complex, remedy.
Yeah, so I just want to echo, this report is fantastic. The reason I'm sitting up here is because right after I read it, I emailed Doug and said, that report is amazing, and I cannot wait to share it with my board. I come at this from a really unique perspective. I represent tech. And so these are high earners for the most part, and they span from startups to enterprise. And I think that the nuance is so important in the index because depending upon the constituency, even within tech that I am speaking to, their lens is so different. So, for instance, I deal with a lot of startups. I spend just an inordinate amount of time talking to startups because what I see is we don't have as many high growth companies here as we used to. But we still have a really robust startup ecosystem because of the schools, because of the education. They want to stay here. And these are job creators, and these are people that are in their office. They're not virtual, but they have a hard time. They can't afford rent to live in or to work in. And they can't afford to hire because they can't afford the salaries to attract people so they can come and live here, right? So they want to stay here though. And then you talk about sort of that middle. Those are people that are grounded here, they have their kids here, education, social aspects of what makes Massachusetts amazing, they stay. They can't hire here. And we're talking tech. So every time a job leaves here, it does not come back. And we are talking tens of thousands of jobs. It is very easy to just place them somewhere else. And the people that they're hiring is not just tech, right? It's marketing, it's sales. So these are jobs that as every company becomes a tech company. And it's really important to think about. It's not going to just be tech. These jobs can be remote. And then at the enterprise level, I was sharing this morning. I had a dinner with several CFOs last night. And what surprised me is that the CERB tax, the millionaire's tax, came up in conversation again. But with real implications, somebody was saying that more than half of their leadership team, out of 11 people, VPs and up, 6 of them have left. So there's implications across the entire spectrum. And I think that it's not one thing that I saw in the report, it's this tsunami of little things that are having the biggest impact.
So, Sara, I'm gonna challenge you on that a little bit and
Sure.
ask a question about where do we begin? I mean, Doug made the point that, in some of the public policy work that's going on now, that not silver bullets, there's a long list of things to work on. Based on your experience and the work you do, based on what you've seen in this report, if there's 1, 2, 3 issues that, we really gotta lean into, what are they? And, I'd ask each of you to comment on that.
So this isn't my area of expertise. I know this is complicated. It's gotta be housing. like 1, 2, and 3 really does have to be housing, because if people can't afford to live here and they do have the option to go someplace else, they will. But I also think, going back to the startups, I know that you know, the governor put forth a budget, and we're still waiting for some of that to come through. I think that kind of policy is really smart policy. When all that money comes to fruition, and that really does help these industries that are ripe to be here, that have the people, that is a huge plus on the policy side. So I think it's housing, and I think it's capital somehow.
You know, I would echo that, actually all your comments, but the one on housing. Since you covered that, I'll go to one of the favorite topics that I always mention. People know I have a tax background, and you know, I didn't pursue a career in tax to do tax returns. I did it because tax policy is really interesting. It moves the needle. It really does sway decisions one way or the other. And unlike some of these really thorny issues that it's going to take years and years to correct, and infrastructural changes, tax can change. It can be, there could be a bill passed the next 6 months, and we could just send a different message to the business community, to others, about our stance. So that's something that I feel like we have to constantly make sure our tax policy is creating the right messaging and environment for the spectrum of individuals and businesses within our state.
So I would echo, I think tax policy, I think housing, and I guess I would look at it in kind of a slightly different way as well, which is when you think about what is best able to predict if someone is going to be able to be in Massachusetts and work in person in the communities that we need them to, it's housing and transportation, right? So macro, I think childcare as well is critical, but when you think of something that everyone uses, everyone needs a house and everyone needs to get to where they're going, right? And then I think to Jane's point, a lot of the direct public policy interventions for housing and transportation take a long time, right? And the public sector isn't always the best place to make investments in things like housing, things like that. And that's where using the tax code, using the regulatory structure to incentivize behaviors so that we can not just say, oh, the public sector is going to do this with this investment, but we're going to incentivize cities and towns to have regulatory structures that allow for more housing, or we're going to use the tax structure, which is the most efficient way usually to transfer resources. We're going to use those things as ways to help that. I think that it's all got to be part of the package. I will say, you know, Jim and I are on that transportation finance task force. When you look at something like transportation, you know, there's no easy solutions there, right? But what we do know is the MBTA, for all of its, you know, challenges, that's a huge asset for Metro Boston, right? Not every city, in fact, most cities don't have a strong subway system, commuter rail system, getting people into an economic hub. And that's why I think continuing some of the progress we see there in terms of making sure that that core system works and works well has got to be a part of the solution, because it cross-cuts getting people to work faster, it cross-cuts commute time, it cross-cuts all those things. So that would be another thing I would add as well.
Well, Doug, thanks for having transportation, because a lot of you in the room know that if he didn't, I would have. You know, we've launched what we call Transportation First as an initiative here at the Chamber, because as you think about housing, as you think about climate change, as you think about economic growth, access, opportunity, underpinning solutions to all of those requires us to lean in on mobility in our transportation system. So I would add that to the list. Part of my job both here and previous life at the convention center was to sell Boston, sell Massachusetts. And you know, you do that recognizing we've got things to work on. And I would submit, by the way, that one of the strengths of Massachusetts that has sustained us over many years is our willingness to confront challenges, as we're doing today and we continue to do. But there's a lot of strengths, Doug. You highlighted them in the report. So I want each of you to put your salesperson's hat on for Massachusetts and talk about the strengths. Talk about how we should tell our story, how we should market Massachusetts as we're competing with all of these other states and cities, given what you saw in the report.
So I think identifying the fact that Massachusetts has many strengths has got to be part and parcel of everything that we do here, right? And you know, it draws me back to sports in that you tend to grow to hate your best players, right? Like over time you develop resentment for what is actually some of your strengths. When you look at Massachusetts, our education system, both K-12, higher ed, public and private, and the interconnection between that, healthcare, life sciences, financial services, tech, that is the playbook that every other state wants, right? It's not elastic to climate change. It's not elastic to prices for natural resources. If you can keep that as a sustaining engine, that's a really, really, really good place to be, right? And we can't lose track of the fact that our public and private higher ed institutions are world class. Our healthcare industry is world class. Our K-12 system, for all its flaws, is one of the best in the world, and is consistently the best in the nation. And so making sure we're not going back in those areas, and that we understand those strengths as a marketing tool as well, I think has got to be critical.
Yeah, I would echo all of that. I mean, we need to have the messaging, we need to amplify world-class education, world-class healthcare, world-class innovative economy. We're very scenic. We have vibrant cities. Like, it is a great place to live. I'd also throw on that, look, no one is immune from the wrath of Mother Nature, but in this whole climate environment, we're actually faring better than a lot of areas. So if there is collaboration out of certain areas that are experiencing wildfires or are habitually hit with hurricanes, it could be that Massachusetts is an easier place to live in that regard.
We're safer.
Well, safer, I don't want to say, because she might be listening.
I think all of those lead up to what I think is our greatest strength. Is our innovation, and that is a feeder to everything. And it's also, we solve the hardest problems here, right? And so going back to Mother Nature, we have such a robust climate tech and sustainability in sector here. We have food tech. We just launched a food tech social party the other day. That in the 4 years has brought over $2 billion of capital. I mean, we are a very well-oiled machine, and I think some of our biggest marketing is that we don't promote it enough. And I would say that is what we need to do the most work in. We all read the index, right? But
And there's always at the end of this, just
yes,
for folks.
actually. But so, a lot of people I talk to, they don't. They're just going and trying to start companies or build companies or hire. And so we need to promote to them that we think we're great, that we're not just looking at the hard problems and trying to solve for them and looking at them negatively, but that we are solving the hard problems, and there's so many reasons to stay. That's it.
Great answers, and I endorse all of that. And, clearly telling our story, it's a big part, and we do have a lot to be proud of. We did a survey of young professionals in the region just recently and asked them about their plans for the future. And the downside of it was that about a third of them said that they don't see themselves here for some of the reasons that you talked about long term. Housing costs being at the top of the list. But on the positive side, 90% of them are happy. 90% of the respondents love being here, love being able to work here, want to start their career, want to grow their family. So we do have a lot going for us when people experience it, but it's these challenges that we need to confront. I want to shift to a little bit of the public policy discussion. Jane, I'll start with you this time. Competitiveness is in the DNA of the people in this room, the business community. I mean, that's what we're all about. Our partner in all of this is government, is legislative and executive branch leadership. How would you characterize the way that the Commonwealth is navigating the competitiveness challenge? Doug highlighted some of the initiatives that have taken place over the past 2 years. How would you success their embrace of this competitiveness agenda and the need to step out our game there?
Yeah, to my delight, I feel as if being competitive is top of mind with this administration. So that is kudos to them. It's a challenging issue, right? So, I really think we need to double down on workforce development, and it's exciting times to think about everything. Sara can speak to this in droves, but with the advent of technology advancements and how fast they're coming, the way that things can change and how we do everything in climate tech, there's a need to skill people. We had a couple of graphs up there about how, we're having out migration, but we're also having in migration. How do we skill people to take advantage of all of these developments and become that labor force that we need for the future versus outdated skills? So I think that's a huge area.
Yeah, I agree. I think this administration has been hands down just wonderful. They are out there and trying to do all the work to keep my constituents here. And I think it really is, I think the policies have to come down to maybe a tax, maybe there's gonna be some sort of investment in capital. And I know they're working on it and they're trying to get that passed and get that through. But I think that's where you're really gonna see some big change policy-wise. And that's what you see in these other states that are vying for our people. They're throwing money at them. And that's attractive. Oh, yeah, please.
And with that, I can't help but talk about tax. So, on the tax front, tax incentives are big. I always say, some people, there's policy issues around tax incentives, and some are just very adverse to them. They have an allergic reaction to them. But what I always say about tax incentives is if you want to compete, you have to get in on the game. The game is being played. Are we going to enter the game or not? And I know that this administration is working on that, but that's a big thing. Then the other thing that I always grapple with is why do we have an estate tax? We have an estate tax which basically says to people, you cannot die in the state. So then they start thinking about, okay, I want to retire someplace else. And so it's like an exit strategy. I think that is counter to keeping some of our higher net worth people here.
One other kind of policy thing that has really jumped out to me, especially in the last few years, which is competing policy priorities can conflict, or at least there can be tension there, right? And I think we need to do a better job for policymakers, for us as people kind of engaged in the civic conversation about understanding that climate goals and housing goals, there's tension there sometimes, right? That if you want housing that is going to meet all your climate goals, oftentimes that's going to be more expensive. And that's not to say that either one of those goals are good or bad, but we have to be honest with ourselves about some of those tensions. Transportation, there can be tension there with some of those goals as well. And so I do think that, oftentimes we want to do a piece of legislation that is just kind of laser focused on that policy area. But the reality is all these things are interconnected. And if we don't kind of take a step back and assess how action in one place affects action somewhere else, I think that, again, the MCAS question for me, the statewide graduation requirement question is a great example of that. You can believe that the current MCAS test is not the world's best assessment tool for 10th grade students in the world. You can absolutely believe that. Does that mean that you think it's a good idea to have no standard for any community, that's cross-cutting any community in the state? No, that's not a good idea, right? And so you need to kind of take a step out of the local policy question of do you like a test or do you not like a test, and understand how it fits into this larger environment. And I think we need to do that in other areas as well.
Doug, I want to stay with you, and I know that certainly our organization, yours, JD's, are all thinking about the legislative public policy agenda for 2025. As it relates to now having done this work, what do you think is at the top of that agenda for the legislature going forward?
Yeah, for me, it starts with the idea that we're not going to solve any of these problems with one fell swoop, right? And a lot of times what can be so paralyzing for our policies in development and housing and transportation can be people looking for this permanent solution to all of our problems. And I've got good news for you, we're not going to do that. That's not going to happen. And so the MBTA is a great example, I think, to start with. One of the things we've talked about is let's try to get the MBTA and our other transportation entities solid footing for 2 years, right? Let's try to stabilize the next 2 or 3 years to build on the progress we've made and buy ourselves some time to see what happens then in years 2 through 10, 10 through 15. We can be looking for year 15 right now, and we should be, but let's focus on how we make sure we stabilize things in year 1 and 2. And I think this gets back to also some of the conversations going on with real estate in Boston property taxes. we know that we've got some challenges in terms of investment and development in downtown Boston. Let's make sure we're not putting in place policies right now that are kind of making that worse in the moment while we're leading to better solutions going forward. So I think it's kind of this short game that also is in service of these longer term goals, because sometimes it can be paralyzing to just try to bite it all off in one fell swoop.
Yeah, great. So I want to dig a little deeper on some of the things we identified as the biggest challenges, and maybe starting with housing. The housing bond bill passed, but now if we think that is the issue to lean into, how do we do that? What is it going to take to create the housing inventory, stock, affordability that we think we need? I know that's a tough question, but.
Yeah, I think some of the laws that have passed that allow, like my, in the towns around me, all of a sudden you can add in, if you have a large enough space, rental housing.
Yeah, ADUs.
Yes, I think that's huge. I think that, we're all probably watching to see this court case with Milton, but towns need to step up. They need to add housing. I think that pending court case, if that goes through, on behalf of the state, those are real huge implications.
So you want to take on the sacred town meeting and local control?
I echo what you say, and also, I know we've been talking about this. I still go back to where we have office vacancies. So we have a housing need, and it's in Boston, and we have vacancies in Boston. And I understand all the issues, I don't understand them fully, but I hear about all the issues that it's hard to do that conversion. But I just feel like something is there, and we need to just double down on that.
One thing I would go back to is the kind of cross connection of different issues. And for example, in housing, there's going to be an appropriations bill early in the next year on education and transportation related to some of the revenues that were collected this year. And a big push is going to be on things like the state school building reform, right? Or money for cities and towns roads, which is called the Chapter 90 program. And we need to make sure that as we go down those roads, we're connecting it to housing goals, we're connecting it to housing policy, we're connecting it to incentives we want other folks to do. There just aren't that many opportunities to use positive or negative incentives impactfully in terms of new resources. We can't afford for them to just be related to education or just be related to transportation. They've got to make it easier for cities and towns to make the right housing choices, because they also want to build new schools. They also want to make sure that they have more frequent commuter rail service. Making sure we're not losing out on that opportunity and saying, oh good, we just spent a bunch of money on education and transportation, now let's go back to housing. That's not going to be the way to success.
Yeah. For us, the housing inventory issue is huge. We're producing less housing in this state than we have for the past 50 years. If you look at the charts of housing production from the 70s to the year 2000, it's more than double what we're producing now. And it's declined even in the last decade even more. So this is about supply and demand. It's pretty straightforward, and I think that we have to stop the policies that inhibit housing production and the free market from working in terms of producing housing, and we have to think about the positive incentive side of things. How do we get this moving? Stop being in the way and get out of the way, and let the free market produce the housing that we need. So I share that as a priority. I want to shift in the time we have remaining to talent workforce. We talk about a talented workforce being a competitive advantage, that it's all about the people. Jane and Sara, you both work in the fields of innovation, innovation economy, and the need for talented people. So, compared to maybe pre-COVID, what are you seeing? What are you seeing in the dynamics of our workforce challenges that have evolved in the last, say, 5 years?
This is like I'm surprised for everybody, but it's actually getting. This is good news. This is good news. I run 3 different type of CEO forums for the larger enterprise, for Series A and B, and for small medium businesses. They all say that in just the past 12 months, their ability to find high level, good talent here, based here, wanting to stay here, has been easier than in the past decade. So this is good. This is good. We just have to keep them here. I think, the biggest concern I see is on the startup side, where some of the talent that's needed might not be here, or it's very expensive, and so they don't have the money they don't have enough in salary to be able to incentivize people to come here. So that is a place where I think I see a need for us to keep working on that. But in terms of the tech talent pool right now, it's good news.
It's great to hear.
Yeah.
I would say, since 2019, there's probably 3 different areas that I've seen a shift. One is the workforce need to adopt technology advancements, whether it's automation or AI. Work skills changing, and I can speak directly to within EY. And then as well as remote hybrid is still there and it's settling down. But from a technology perspective, if I think of EY being, it's a multidisciplinary firm, we do audit, we do tax, we do all types of consulting. In every single service line, we're infusing automation. Every single one. And now I'm finding out with RFPs and opportunities, our clients are looking to whether or not we have infused technology to create the efficiencies and the accuracies that they're demanding. So with our workforce, we need our workforce to embrace the advancements and make sure that we're staying in the forefront, not falling behind, because I think it's going to keep a competitive edge with us. So we need a workforce that's nimble, dynamic, and receptive to the changes. The other thing is, as our economy starts to shift into new industries, cyber, climate, sustainability, ESG, so is in our workforce skills that we're demanding of our professionals. Gone are the days of auditing and tax. We have somebody within EY that does everything because there's so much advancement going on. These new industries are emerging. So I find it extremely exciting, similar to what Sara was saying. And then since 2019, we've had this whole hybrid, remote. It seems to be settling down. It seems as if, I was saying for the longest time, the earth is still shifting below us, our feet, but it really seems to be settling down. We're all getting into a new mode. It could be 3 days a week, some are gravitating more towards 5 days a week, but that seems to be settling.
Yeah, one of the data points that stuck out for me was the 5-year change in labor force size, where we ranked 48. And in my work and in my discussions with people who do this work in other states, as you're talking to a business about locating in your city or in your state, one of the top questions is, am I going to have the labor for my factory, for my business, for my institution? It's really a top question. Are you going to be able to supply the labor that I need? So that's certainly something worth leaning into. I want to get into, because of particularly because of this panel that I do have, another data point I was struck with, that we ranked 35th in the country in business formations and the lowest ranking among our competitiveness. I've seen similar rankings, one by the U.S. Census, that Massachusetts ranked 47 in new business startups. So, we've got Harvard, MIT, we've got all these smart people innovating and doing things. Why aren't they starting their businesses in Massachusetts, and should we be concerned about it? Doug, you want to kick that off?
Yeah, I would just say, when you look at the metrics that we examined, for the most part, you would kind of have a guess of where we're going to rank, right? And that was one that jumped out to me as saying, oh, geez, I thought this was going to be a competitive advantage for ours, and it is not. And it's gotten worse over the last 15 years, right? So we've kind of declined there. I think Sara and Jane probably have more practical expertise in terms of what's happening on the ground. But I do think one of the things you hear about is that kind of tech transfer from higher ed to other sectors, that other regions of the state may be more welcoming and lower cost initially to really get started, right? And the one thing we weren't able to really find a good proxy for is regulatory kind of red tape, right? That there's no good way to cross-rank all 50 states on that, but that's something that we kind of thought about as we thought that was that a real factor, and that's something that we're looking to try to incorporate in future versions.
Yeah, from the startup sector.
Yeah, so again, this is an area where if it is becoming a competitive disadvantage, it's something within our control. I mean, we should be looking to our sister states and saying, what is the ease of doing business, of starting up a company, of the regulatory framework in a different state, and where is ours? Compare and contrast and make the changes. It's that simple, and I'm simplifying everything, but it is. It's laws that can be changed. So it's disheartening to hear that is not a strength of ours. It should be a strength of ours. We are a society of innovation and entrepreneurs. We need to support that community.
There was two things. The first, and they're connected. It's funding. That is ultimately. I mean, this is what they will all tell you. True or not, right? I mean, some of this is just a thought, right? That people think I gotta go to the West Coast if I am going to start my company, and I want to be where OpenAI is and Google, right? So there's a perception, but in terms of funding, we have a lot of money here. We have a lot of private money here, but Massachusetts in particular is known to be very, very traditional, and they're not as apt to give valuations or funding, and so startups, they'll just go someplace else for ease. The second, and this is also worse in Massachusetts, anecdotal, but again, I talked to enough people that it's pretty solid. It's really hard for women to start companies here, and so they don't want to try. They'll just, and these companies can be very, very successful, and they just, it's, in all, I'd say we have all of the right things to want people to stay here. Talent, startups, all of it. We just somehow make it hard. And that's ultimately what I think we need to figure out. How do we remove friction and just make it easier? Particularly for women entrepreneurs, particularly for diverse entrepreneurs.
Great theme, stop making it hard. So Doug, I'm going to ask you to take us home here and tell us about the reaction you've gotten and what's next. Going to be a second edition of this terrific report, and by the way, thank you for doing it.
Well, thank you so much for this forum today as well. It's been great to partner with you and your team on this event, and as Jane mentioned before, great to work with MACP as well. So we are planning to do this, and I haven't told my team this yet, but this is going to be an annual report. And we have to do that municipal data report again now. So yeah, we want to make sure we are doing this as a regular thing in the fall. I think this was the first one. Are we wedded to 26 metrics? Might we go down to 20? Hopefully not up to 40. I think we want to make sure it's adaptable to what people care about. There are some things, I got some great feedback as Steve Silvera's here, right? And Steve mentioned to me the other day, is there a way to look at climate risk, right? To look at some of these things that I think really do matter, right? That really are affecting people's location decisions. So we want to make sure we keep that kind of core of labor force, education, things like that. But we also want to make sure we're adapting it to some of the questions that I think really are important for us. And there were a couple areas I mentioned. Regulatory structure was one where we didn't feel like we got it totally right. So that's something we're going to do again. And then I think the other key question, this is some feedback we've gotten as well, is kind of so what, right? So we're doing this competitiveness index. How do we make sure we're applying this to policies? And how do we make sure we're applying this to what we're doing, whether it's transportation, housing, things like that? And so that's something that we want to hopefully do with some of the other work we're doing in MTF and with groups like the Chamber. But that's, I think, a key focus for us as well, is kind of making sure as we head into the new session, we're talking about how things come back to some of the issues we're talking about today.
Great. Sara, Jane, Doug, thank you for your insights. Thank you to the Mass Taxpayers Foundation for your partnership in producing such a meaningful report, and yeah, I look forward to partnering with you and JD and others leaning into this issue of competitiveness going forward. Thank you all for joining us, both live and those in the virtual audience, and have a great rest of the week.